G'day YouTube, welcome to my introductory video series on Plato. I don't know how many videos I will end up making on Plato, but I intend it to be something of a complete introduction to Plato's philosophy. By that I mean the series will introduce all of the major ideas in Plato's philosophy. I think Plato is a good place to start if you're new to philosophy for a whole host of reasons really, and I won't go into them now except to mention two of them. So the first reason is that Plato is an opportunity to examine a profound philosophical position without encountering a lot of the technical jargon that you will probably see in contemporary philosophical literature. And the second reason is that he had a huge influence on later thinkers, and that influence remains today. These first few videos are just meant to be a brief overview of Plato's ideas, and we'll go into more depth later on in the video series. So, he was born, we think, between 429 BC to 347 BC. Those are his dates. And remember, the years in BC count down towards 0. So there's an epistle called the 7th letter, and we don't really know if it's genuine, so we don't know whether Plato wrote it or whether it's a forgery. But if it's genuine, then we can treat it as part of his autobiography. And he says in the 7th letter, if it really is Plato's work, that the politics of his day ended up bringing him to the conclusion that only philosophers could be fit to rule. So Socrates is someone who you'll become quite familiar with in this video series, and Socrates was Plato's teacher. Plato had many teachers, but Socrates is the most prominent teacher of Plato, and Socrates dies around 399 BC. So after Socrates' death, Plato goes traveling quite extensively. During this time, he makes his first trip to the island of Sicily, and he gets quite tangled up in the politics there. This is what contributes to some of the skepticism about the authenticity of the 7th letter. So in Sicily, there's an important city called Syracuse, that's S-Y-R-A-C-U-S-E, pronounced Syracuse. And this city is ruled by the tyrant Dionysius II. Now, the opposition party was led by a man named Dion, and the two are struggling for the rulership of Syracuse. Now, Dion was familiar with Plato's ideas, he believed Plato's doctrines, he's a disciple of Plato. So Dion is what we'd call a Platonist. And some people think that the 7th letter was a political propaganda document forged to support Dion, to give the impression that Plato supported Dion as the ruler of Syracuse. So keep this in mind when reading the 7th letter. If you buy a book, which is the collection of Plato's works, or the collective works of Plato, it's likely to include the 7th letter. So keep this skepticism in mind. Some people are adamant that it's authentic, some people are adamant that it's not. We just don't know. All the evidence is in, and it's inconclusive. So it's a matter of scholarly dispute. So moving on, Plato visits Sicily at least 3 times, and we suspect that he may have been richly subsidized by Dionysius, the father of Dionysius II. And after returning from Sicily, he starts a school in Athens, which came to be known as the Academy. And that's where we get the English word from, as well as, academia, academic, words like that. And the details of Plato's life are pretty sparse. So this is partly because the writing conventions of ancient Athens, or because of the writing conventions of ancient Athens. So nowadays we have all these writing conventions, right, for different kinds of works, from essays to newspaper articles, etc. For example, it's common to mention academics in an essay by last name only. And if the reader wants to know the person's full name, then they can check your references, your reference list, your bibliography. So Athens also had writing conventions, and one of their conventions was not to mention another writer directly by name. And this is partly motivated by something which is still common today in philosophy, and that is to restrict your criticism to ideas rather than people. So there's not much philosophical gain in scrutinizing individual people rather than ideas. So for example, suppose I was writing something about politics and I wanted to talk about President Donald Trump's ideas or President Trump himself, and I'm following the literary conventions of ancient Athens. Instead of mentioning Trump directly, I'd say something like, there is currently a politician amongst us that wants to build a wall between Mexico and the US, something like that. Now, to everyone in our time, it's obvious who I'm referring to. However, even in our time, there are other politicians who support Trump's desire to build such a wall. And as the centuries go by, it won't be as obvious to people in the future who I'm referring to. I could be referring to Trump, or I could be referring to other politicians who people in the future know, as a matter of historical record, also wanted that wall to be built. So in this scenario, the people in the future who are reading what I've written, if they had nothing else to go off, they would probably think that I was likely referring to Trump, but they'd also think there's a chance that I was referring to someone else, perhaps Mike Pence, for instance. So we probably have a lot of preserved philosophical work from Plato's time, where authors are talking about Plato and his ideas, but we just don't know that they're referring to Plato. So Aristotle, another famous philosopher, he was a student of Plato for at least 20 years, and even Aristotle gives us pretty much no information about Plato's life. And as a result, this makes the dating of Plato's work difficult. Really, it has to be established by internal evidence, which is to say by reading the work itself and looking for clues within it. So this makes Plato's work difficult to date. Moving on. So Plato is famous for his dialogues, and fortunately for us, they are all preserved. So Plato wrote in dialogue form as opposed to treatise form, and this means that when you read Plato's work, you'll be reading a conversation that takes place between characters in the dialogue that are debating about some philosophical question or problem, as opposed to a treatise, which it feels like the author is directly talking to you and you are having a one-way conversation with them. So in Plato's dialogues, it's like you are an additional person in the room watching or listening to a debate take place. The dialogues are usually divided into three periods, the early, middle, and late periods respectively. The early dialogues include, and I should caveat before listing them, that I'm not a scholar of classical languages, so I don't speak ancient Greek. So I'm likely to mispronounce some of these names of the dialogues. However, if you are a scholar of the ancient Greek language, then this is a rare, perhaps exciting opportunity for you to apply your knowledge and to correct me in the comments. I'm just joking. The study of classical languages is important, for many things, like understanding history and understanding the work of some of these ancient Greek philosophers, because actually much understanding depends on the translation of ancient Greek terms, which don't translate very neatly into English. But really, if I pronounce some of these names wrong and you know better, please let me know in the comments. So the early dialogues are Hippias Minor, Laches, Charmides, Ion, Protagoras, Euthyphro, Apology, Crito, Gorgias, Meno, Cratylus, and the doubtful Hippias Major, Lysis, Menexenus, and Euthydemus. And the middle dialogues include Phaedo, Philebus, Symposium, Republic, So that's Plato's most famous dialogue and arguably his most important one, and Theaetetus. Whereas the late era, they include Critias, Parmenides, Phaedrus, Sophist, Statesman, Timaeus, and Laws. And that last one, Laws, that's the longest of all the dialogues. So many of these dialogues, not all, but many, are also the names of people that Socrates or Plato knew, and some of them are the names of other famous philosophers from this period, like Protagoras and Parmenides. So in the video series, we're going into the main ideas that come out of these dialogues, and yes, I have read all of them. It's good fun. Moving on. So the early dialogues establish the figure of Socrates, who you'll become very familiar with and perhaps quite attached to before he dies. And he's portrayed as just endlessly questioning and ruthlessly shattering what he takes to be the false claims to knowledge of his contemporaries. So Socrates employs what was known at the time as the elenctic method, which comes from the ancient Greek word elenchus. And elenchus means something like cross-examination in English, like a lawyer's cross-examination. However, it's a bit different because the goal of the elenctic method is to get to truth and to learn. And everyone involved is supposed to be open-minded and happy to be shown wrong, willing to put aside agendas, etc. So, it's considered a success if we all learn something. And since Socrates was so good at it and so frequent in the use of the elenctic method, it has come to be known as the Socratic method. And that's what I'll call it during the rest of the video series. So it's a method of teaching in which, the master, so to speak, really imparts no information, but instead asks a sequence of questions, and it's through answering that the pupil or the student eventually comes to the desired knowledge. And there's a term associated with the Socratic method called Socratic irony, and this is just referring to the pose of ignorance adopted by the master or the questioner, the teacher. And that pose is one of feigning ignorance, because the master does in fact know more than they're letting on. So the irony comes from the fact that this person is teaching you by pretending not to know anything, not to know stuff about what you're talking about. So that's Socratic irony. So I said that the goal of the elenctic method or the Socratic method is to help the student reach, the desired knowledge, whatever that may be. So what is that desired knowledge in Plato's case, or in Socrates' case? Excuse me. In a really broad sense, the aim here, in Socrates or Plato's case, is to clear the intellectual ground, so to speak, of any pre-assumptions or prior beliefs which Socrates or Plato think are dubious, and establish something else in its place. So what's that something else in its place? The something else, which is the desired knowledge that I referred to earlier, in this case is an understanding of virtue. So Socrates and Plato are very concerned with understanding what is good, understanding the just and appropriate appreciation of virtue. They're very concerned with moral questions. Okay, and this is a common theme throughout all of Plato's work. Okay, but in the early dialogues, more is done negatively towards this aim than positively. And what do I mean by that? Well, negative work or negative answers in philosophy is just when you're concerned with a philosophical question or problem, and you're considering some potential answers. They may be your proposed tentative answers or other people's, and after some philosophical analysis or reflection, you decide that the answer you were considering can't be the right answer. So basically, negative work is flagging answers as wrong answers. You haven't answered the question, but you've dismissed some potential answers, or maybe you've made an attempt at answering the question and you've dismissed it as not being acceptable. Positive work, on the other hand, or positive answers, those are just the opposite. That's when you or someone else are putting forth and defending what you think the answer to a philosophical problem is. So when you are doing negative work, you're often criticizing someone else's positive work. It might even be your own positive work, your own prior positive work. In fact, there's numerous historical examples in philosophy where a philosopher has written a book or a paper or something like that and gained something of a following or some agreement from the philosophical community, only to realize years later that they think they were wrong or made a mistake, and write another book to convince people to reject their prior work. Okay, so for example, the philosopher Wittgenstein did something kind of like this. So my long-winded point is that the early dialogues contain a lot more negative than positive work, and that just means that the early dialogues spend more time criticizing positions and views rather than offering positions and defending them. Okay, so Socrates is often asking in these dialogues a question of the form, what is X? Where X can be anything from virtue, justice, courage, love, and friendship, and so on. And he's shown as brushing aside these answers provided by his friends as just mere examples of X, as opposed to the true essence or the form of X, which is what Socrates wants to know, or Plato wants to know. So now this term in bold here, form, so that's a very important concept in Plato, and we're going to spend some time later in the video series understanding what it means. I won't go into too much detail about it in these sort of overview videos, which will just be the first few videos in this series. But later in the series I will, and we'll have to explore it quite intimately, because it's a big feature of Plato's philosophy. Okay, so moving on. So this is a good time to mention Reductio ad absurdum, which is a form, and when I say form, I don't mean the forms that I was talking about before. I just mean the everyday meaning of form, so not Plato's forms. So Reductio absurdum is a form of argument from logic or critical reasoning, commonly used in philosophy and employed ad nauseum by Socrates, right? So Reductio ad absurdum is Latin for reduction to absurdity, and there are some other ways of translating it, but they all really come down to the same thing. So basically it can happen in two broad ways, depending on whether the goal is to argue that some statement is true or whether it's to argue that some statement is false. But in either case, the idea is the same. So you take a statement that you want to argue is false, and then you show that it ends up leading to an absurd or contradictory or impractical conclusion. Or the other way around, you want to show that some statement is true, and you say, well, suppose it's false. Then you end up showing that its falsity would lead to some absurd conclusion, and since we can't accept absurd conclusions, we have to reject the assumption that generated it, and that assumption is that the initial statement was false. Okay, and since we're rejecting the falsity of the initial statement, that is the same thing as accepting the truth of the initial statement, right? Okay, so if you think that it's false that some statement is false, well, that's the same thing as thinking that the statement is true. Okay, unless you are perhaps some kind of non-classical logician, of course, and perhaps I'll make a video series on non-classical logic one day. Okay, so there are things to come. Anyways, it's kind of like rejecting the statement that your front door is open, is the same as accepting the statement that your front door is closed, right? Okay, so that's kind of what happens at the end of a reductio argument. Anyways, so here are some simple examples of reductio arguments, which is what we call them for short. So here we have, the Earth cannot be flat. Okay, so let's perform a reductio argument on this statement, and in our case, we're going to argue that the statement is true. Okay, and we start off by supposing that the statement is false, and we see where that reasoning leads us. So suppose that the initial statement is false. Well, that would be the same thing as claiming that the Earth is flat. Okay, well, if the Earth is flat, okay, then we would find people falling off the edge. All right, but we do not find people falling off the edge of the Earth, so therefore the Earth is not flat. Okay, so here's another more interesting one. Okay, the statement is there is no smallest positive rational number. Okay, so you all know what a positive and negative number is. Well, a positive rational number is just a positive number which is an integer divided by an integer. Okay, so like a whole number divided by a whole number, and the number in the denominator, which is the number under the bar, so the numerator's on top, the denominator's on the bottom. The denominator cannot be 0 because we can't divide by 0. So that's what a rational number is, okay? All right, so there's no smallest positive rational number. And what we're going to do is, similarly to the previous example, we're going to argue for the support of this statement. So we're going to argue that it's true. In fact, we're going to do better than just argue. We're actually going to give a proof. Okay, so suppose the statement is false. Well, if it's false, in other words, we're supposing that there is a smallest rational number. So let's just give it a name. Let's call it Z. So Z is the smallest positive rational number because we've supposed that there is one. Okay, well then we could divide Z by the number 2. Which is the same thing as multiplying Z by a half. And a half is a rational number, 1 over 2, okay? So we have a rational number multiplied by a rational number, namely 1/2 times Z, and a rational number times a rational number just equals another rational number, okay? So that property in mathematics is called closure, okay? So rational numbers are closed under multiplication. It would be one way of saying it. It means if you take a rational number and you multiply it by another rational number, you don't leave the rational numbers. You don't get some other kind of number. Your answer is going to be a rational number. But anyways, since we divided Z by 2, all right, we've made a smaller rational number since a half is always smaller than a whole. Okay, and this contradicts our assumption that there is a smallest rational number, right? Because we said suppose we've got the smallest one and then we made it smaller, so we've contradicted ourselves. Okay, because notice we could just really reapply this argument again and again, ad infinitum, and keep producing smaller rational numbers. Okay, so we have to reject the assumption that generated the contradiction, and that assumption is that there is a smallest rational number, and rejecting that is the same thing as accepting that there is no smallest rational number. And that's our initial statement. That's the statement we wanted to support. Okay, so we did more than support it. We actually proved it, just verbally. We didn't give a written proof. So because this last example is actually a special kind of reductio ad absurdum argument called proof by contradiction. All right, and that's when an absurd conclusion and that's when the absurd conclusion has to be an explicit contradiction, not just a really strange or seemingly unacceptable conclusion, right? So a contradiction is like saying A and not A, right? So, A is true and A is false, okay? And we got something of that kind. We got an explicit contradiction, okay? So it's commonly used to prove theorems in mathematics, okay? So the point is Socrates employs reductios all the time during the Socratic method, okay? So moving on. Before I end this video, because I don't want them to be too long, I think we should do an example of, excuse me, the Socratic method to get a feel for things to come. Okay, so in the dialogue Republic, Socrates is talking to a man named Polemarchus, who was also a philosopher and the brother of Lysias and also the brother of Euthydemus, who 2 other dialogues are named after, right? Okay, and Socrates and Polemarchus attempt to define justice. Okay, so Polemarchus, he's taking some inspiration from an ancient Greek poet named Simonides. So Polemarchus, following Simonides, defines justice as giving each person what is owed to them, because the repayment of a debt is just, right? And Socrates asks Polemarchus what it is we owe to our friends and enemies, if Simonides is correct. Okay, so Polemarchus answers that we owe good to our friends and evil to our enemies. Okay, and Socrates asks who is in the best position to act justly when people are sick or when they are on a perilous voyage. Okay, and Polemarchus answers that it is the physician, the medical practitioner, and the pilot of a ship, respectively. And when asked how people in general are to act accordingly, that is, to act justly, Polemarchus responds that it is by going to war with our enemies and making alliances with our friends. Okay, and then Socrates then exposes a flaw in the argument. Okay, so Socrates' response is that the person who is healthy has no need of a physician. So healthy people don't need to see doctors. And the person who's not on a voyage at sea doesn't need a pilot. Okay, you don't need the captain of a ship if you're not on a ship and you're not at sea. And the person who is not at war just doesn't need to harm their enemies. Okay, so therefore, the physician cannot be just when no one is sick, and the pilot cannot be just when the pilot's, when the pilot is not captaining a ship at sea, when the pilot's not on a voyage. And in times of peace, there can be no justice. All right, and this last one is rather nice because Polemarchus has said that justice involves making alliances with our friends and going to war with our enemies. Okay, well then, in times of peace, there's no war, and there would be no justice according to this definition. You would only have half of the definitions. You just have alliances with your friends, but you wouldn't be going to war with your enemy. All right, and it's a rather absurd conclusion that justice is of no use during peacetime, or there can be no justice during peacetime. So this would lead us to reject Polemarchus's definition, which is inspired by the poet Simonides. So this is an example of the Socratic method, in which Socrates, or Plato through Socrates, has employed reductio ad absurdum, in this case to show that an initial statement is false. And this is also an example of negative work. Okay, so we're going to continue this overview of Plato in the next video. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe, and maybe share it with your friends. Bye for now.